Luke has largely taken over from Mark. Then we have the time for him to set his face for Jerusalem. And there's a curious incident where they're going to a Samaritan village, and John and James, the brothers who are sons of Zebedee, want to bring fire down. That's interesting because in Mark they are called Boanerges, sons of thunder, but not in Luke. It's in Luke that we get them wanting to bring fire down on the Samaritan village. But they move on. Jesus doesn't let them. And then, one of the great parables. A lawyer approaches Jesus. A lawyer being a man who is well versed in the law, which is the Torah, the law of Moses. He's not somebody who stands up in court and defends you or prosecutes you. This keeps clicking in the wrong. That's where. Okay. Stay. So a lawyer who is versed in the law, and he is issuing a challenge of Jesus. Notice he stood up to test Jesus. So he's not asking a question in order to gain information. He's actually wanting to embarrass Jesus by asking him a question which Jesus either can't answer or answers badly or gives him an opening to put Jesus down. This is a contest which happened in this part of the ancient world, which is to do with honor and shame. The lawyer is trying to gain prestige for himself by putting Jesus down. But if he loses, then he's shamed, and Jesus only goes up. This was a sort of contest which would happen in public, and it's the public who will decide who's winning and who's losing, and it has to be between equals. You can't challenge your superior, or you wouldn't want to challenge your inferior. It has to be people who are peers at the same level. So he tests Jesus, and he says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Fair question. And how does Jesus answer? He says, "What does the law say? What do you read there?" He's actually insulting the lawyer. Because what he's actually saying is, you're a lawyer, you know the law, you can read, can't you? It's a calculated insult to the man, which is fair game in this sort of context. This is what's going on in terms of a shame-honor dispute, but it's all part of the social fabric of the ancient world in the Roman Empire, where you would have patrons and clients. The great supreme patron was the emperor, and everybody was his client, but then a web of interrelationships where a client of the emperor would himself be a patron to others. If you want to know how this is going on, think of any film set in Chicago in the 1930s. Because where did the mafia come from? The mafia came largely from Sicily or Italy. And it's their social world which is being transferred to Chicago. So you have the great patron, who is the godfather, Il Capo, and he'll be paying minions to follow him round and basically be his cheerleaders. So wherever he goes, he's acclaimed. A sort of claque, as you'd find in the opera. Honor counts for everything. Part of the mafia honor, of course, is omerta, silence. That's part of the whole regime. And the challenge response is what's going on here. Somebody challenging another in order to increase their prestige, their esteem. So the lawyer says, "What must I do?" And Jesus says, "What do you read there?" And then the man, notice, and Jesus, and he answers the question regarding the Shema, to love your Lord your God, and Jesus says, "Do that, and life will be yours." So he first of all answered the question with a question, and then actually answered the question, "Do this, and life will be yours. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Do this, follow the Shema, and life will be yours." But the man has lost round one, presumably because the audience have let him know that he's a bit of an idiot. And so he has to redeem himself He has to justify himself, is the word used, because he's going down the scale. So he's got to try and get back up. And so he asked Jesus a question which was a very live debate in the ancient world in the first century, in Judaism. Who is my neighbour? And you get very many different answers. For some people, your neighbour was only your kinsfolk, those in your own clan, and everybody else was to be shunned. But others would be more enlightened and would say, no, every Jew in the land is surely my neighbour, and I have to look out for them. And some even more, perhaps progressive, would say, every Jew in the world, even those in the far-off diaspora, we're still sort of kinsfolk, and I have to look out for them. And it was much debated. But no Jew in this society at this time would ever go beyond the bounds of Judaism. They'd never say, oh, Mrs. Smith down the road, she's a Gentile, but she's ever so lovely. She surely... No, they'd never do that. And indeed, we had an example of Jesus calling a Gentile woman a dog. That was the normal sort of expression. So, what's Jesus going to answer? Because this is very much a trick question. Whatever he answers, people are going to disagree with him, because there's such a range of opinion. So Jesus answers with a story. There was a man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Immediately the people hear that opening of the story, they're thinking, what? On his own? No. One of the things you never do in the ancient world is travel on your own. Because it's dangerous. There are thieves and vagabonds out there. Indeed, on the top of the Jericho Road, you don't travel it these days. There's a tunnel that goes through the Mount of Olives. But in the old days, your coach would go either from Jericho up to Jerusalem or from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And the guide would always point out the soil at the top of the Jericho Road, because it's red. It's got a ferrous, an iron content. But that wasn't why it was red, according to folklore, folk tradition. People said it's red because of all the blood that's been spilt on that road, because people have walked it on their own and they've fallen in the hands of brigands and thieves. It's the blood of victims. So you don't do it on your own. If this guy's going on his own, in the South African context, I used to say to my students, imagine somebody landing in Cape Town International Airport, one of our American friends, the checks of his trousers as loud as his voice, as he's heard to say, with his wallet coming out of his back pocket, and the state-of-the-art cine camera on the front of the Cadillac he's hired. And he's heard to say, now, which is the way to Khayelitsha? One of the great squatter camps. You'd never hear of him again, of course, if that were to happen. And that's the situation of this guy. If he's going on his own down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, he's going to be waylaid. He's going to end up dead. Now, in a sense, he's fortunate. He's left simply naked and unconscious. But he's half dead, and that means he's going to expire quite quickly, unless there's urgent help given. And a priest comes by, and the priest passes by, famously, on the other side. And we all go, boo, nasty priest, or even typical priest. Jesus' audience would have said, quite right, good priest, doing his job. Because a priest, by his birth, is a priest set apart to offer sacrifice. A priest must at all times keep ritually clean. The only corpse he can go anywhere near is his father's corpse, if he is the eldest son, and his duty, which overrides all things, is to close his father's eyes. Otherwise, no corpse impurity. This priest has, in all likelihood, taken a huge detour from Jerusalem, not going straight over the Mount of Olives, because going up the Mount of Olives is to go through a graveyard, then as now. So he avoids the danger of corpse impurity by going a long way round. Then he's at the top of the Mount of Olives, he's rode down to Jericho, and blow me, there's a corpse. Because as far as he can tell, it's a corpse. And he must keep 4 cubits away from it. And so quite rightly, he passes by on the other side. And the crowd would say, yes, good on him. A Levite is a functionary of the temple, and he could administer first aid, but there's a good reason why he won't want to. And he too passes by on the other side. Then you'd expect a layman in the Englishman, Irishman, Scotsman, Jesuit, Franciscan, Dominican way of jokes. You'd expect a layman, priest, a Levite, layman. But it's not. Well, it is. It's a Samaritan. A Samaritan. A horrid, nasty, mixed race, vile scum of the earth, which is exactly how the Jews thought of Samaritans. But it's also how Samaritans thought of Jews. The reasons are way back in history, but basically the Jews thought that they were mixed race, and while they kept the law of Moses and worshipped the one God, Yahweh, on their holy mountain, Mount Gerizim, they were still the scum of the earth and had nothing to do with Samaritans, please. He is moved in his bowels, his splanger, and takes pity on the man, and uses oil and wine to bathe his wounds, puts him on his own horse, takes him to the inn, and then leaves the innkeeper, who were notoriously crooks and swindlers. Think of Les Miserables, and you have the picture of an ancient innkeeper, and he gives him a blank check. He says, here's a couple of denarii, and if you need any more, then I'll make good what you need on my way back. And the question becomes, this has done it again. Why does it keep doing this? I don't know. But the question will become, that's a map of the place, who is more foolish? Because the man who's fallen among thieves has been really, really foolish in taking the journey on his own. But then this Samaritan is, if anything, even more stupid. Because one of the reasons why the Levite would not have hung around is because of this strange code of honour. If your relative, a kinsfolk, is murdered, or indeed severely damaged, as a relative of the person who's been injured, you have a solemn religious duty to take vengeance on those who have done it. You become, somebody is named as the Goel, the avenger. Now, clearly, the person that you would want to take it out on are the people who have perpetrated the crime. But they're long gone. If we look at the map, look at the hills there. Any brigands can disappear and never be found. They'll know their way around, and if you had the Israeli army out there, they wouldn't find them if they didn't want to be found. So you're not going to find the perpetrators. The rules of engagement then say, and this will sound very strange to us, but nevertheless, anyone at the scene of the crime will do nicely, thank you. So, not only was the priest doing his job in avoiding the corpse, but he would want to scarper and not be seen at the scene. The Levite too would want to be well away. Then the Samaritan says, not only was I there, but I'm going to come back. So if his relatives are here, they'll be ready to take vengeance on him. Crazy! Now this is one of the classic parables where I think we can only understand it, really understand it, after the resurrection. Because clearly Jesus is the Samaritan figure who will go out of his way to help somebody who not only will not be thankful, because I suspect when the man woke up, he would have been furious that he'd been manhandled by a cursed Samaritan, who'd used his wine, his oil, to tend to his wounds, and he'd say, you should have left me for dead. But somebody who will not be thanked for what they've done, but also are putting themselves in mortal danger by what they've done. What does Jesus do for us? He dies on the cross for us. We can only understand this parable, I think, from the perspective of post-resurrection and post-crucifixion. Who was more foolish? Then, after that incident, the brilliant telling of the story, he goes to a village, and Martha and Mary welcome him. There's no man in the house They're associated with Lazarus in John's Gospel, but it's Martha who welcomes him. She's the host. And everybody, of course, thinks that she complains against her sister because her sister's sitting at the feet of Jesus when she should be helping Martha in the kitchen, for goodness sake. Nothing to do with that. Almost certainly. What Martha is complaining about is where Mary is. She's in the wrong place. As a woman, she should be in the back of the house with the children if there are children, but not mixing with the men, because the men and the women didn't mix in this society. Of course they did, they had children, but basically in society, each had their place. And they didn't mix. And Martha's saying, Lord, she's in the wrong place. Get her back to where she should be. And Jesus says, she's fine, thank you very much. She's chosen the better part, the better portion. It's a meal imagery. Jesus is happy in the company of women, which is so countercultural, it's amazing he got to Jerusalem without being killed first. Then we have the parable of the man wanting help because people have turned up in the middle of the night. And this is actually, again, to do with honour and shame, I think. It's not to do with the person being in bed and not wanting to get out. Because what the crucial line is, if you won't do this for honour's sake, honour shame's sake, it's to do with if you let the side down, you will be disgraced in the village. And everybody was supposed to help out when an emergency happened, like somebody turning up at night time, which they often would, because the time for travel is night time, in the cool of the night. And so people could turn up, and you have to offer them hospitality. And everybody has a part to play in that. And they would be shamed, disgraced, if they didn't play their part. We then have the story of the man who has a bumper harvest. And what does he do? He knocks down all his barns to build bigger ones, so that he can eat, drink, and be merry. Tomorrow, of course, we die. It's exactly what happens to him. What should he have done? Because God had shown great graciousness to him in giving him an abundant harvest, he should have shared it with everybody. And they would have said, you are wonderful, you are terrific, we will honour your memory forever. And instead, God takes him. He never gets to party. But in this story, you've got to wonder who he would party with. Because in the story, he only speaks to himself. He speaks to his soul. There's nobody for him to share with. He's a very sad man, really. But there is an interpretation of the story which says he didn't actually have a heart attack. Reading between the lines, the villagers would have taken it out on him. They'd have seen what should come to them in his barns, and he sticks around. Silly, silly man. We have a lot of absentee landlords in the Bible. Take their advice if you have a bumper harvest. Be an absentee. This fool, God says, you fool, to the man. We then have stories of fire and division. It's a hard world out there. We need to read the signs of the times, Luke tells us. We have tragedies which happen in Jerusalem. Pilate mixes the blood of their sacrifices with some Galileans. A tower falls down, and Jesus speaks about the need for repentance. These weren't wicked people, but you've got to repent, or else you might share their same fate. Herod Antipas, the ruler in Galilee, is referred to as that fox, which probably refers to more his rapacious nature than his cunning. That was the way in the ancient world. We get talk about where you should take your place. Social commentary. Jesus noticed how people were taking the best places, and he pulls them down and says, take the lowest place. It's a joke, because nobody would ever take that sort of advice. But it's actually what Jesus, of course, does himself. He will take the lowest place possible when he's hanging on the cross. And he gives advice. Again, I think it's meant to be almost humorous. When you give a dinner party, don't invite your friends and neighbours for fear they'll repay you. It's how the world works, isn't it? You invite them, they invite you. And that's how How will we go on? But no, when you have a party, invite the lame, the blind, the crippled, the poor, those who can't repay you. Who did Jesus eat with? He ate with those who had no chance of ever repaying him. Such is the gracious generosity of our God. Be warned, there's a cost to being a disciple. The king, the person building a tower has to work out whether he can afford it, as the king going to war has. And then the great chapter 15. One of the great chapters of the whole of the Hebrew Bible, where the Pharisees and the scribes are complaining about Jesus' table company because he eats with those sorts of people. He doesn't just give advice, he actually follows his advice. So at his table will be the blind, the sick, the lame, the down and outs, the destitutes, the no-goods, the scum, all the low-life is there, and the Pharisees and scribes complain because he's making himself unclean by mixing with the unclean. So Jesus tells a parable. We'd say there were 3 parables, but Luke says a parable. The first of which is the lost sheep. Man has 100 sheep. No man would own 100 sheep, because then he'd be rich, and therefore he'd pay somebody to look after his sheep. So he's looking after the sheep of the whole village. And he's become a bad shepherd because he's done his count and it's only 99. He does not leave the 99. If he did, when he came back, there wouldn't be 99. There'd be no sheep left. He leaves them with other people who are looking after the sheep, because 100 is too many for one man to look after on his own. So he leaves them in care. But he has to go and find the lost sheep. Why? Because if he doesn't, what will people say? They won't simply say he's a bad shepherd. They will say, more than that, they'll say he's a thief. Either he sold it or he's eaten it. Whichever way, he's taken what wasn't his. And he's a bad shepherd, and whose reputation will forever be, can't trust him. He's got to find the sheep. But sheep, when they get lost, what do? They don't, run up a flag on a flagpole. They simply sit and go, "Bah, bah, bah," and that's lost in the wind. So you're looking in scrub country for a sheep that looks like scrub. He has to search very hard, but he's got to find this sheep. And when he does, in Luke's gospel, it's only Luke who tells us this detail, what does he do with the sheep? To give you a clue, the sheep won't move of its own accord, because it's terrified, so it's just sitting. The great image, which is one of the most ancient images we have of Jesus, which is as the good shepherd carrying the sheep on his shoulders, because it's a cruciform image, if you think about it. But what will a sheep do when it is scared stiff and then picked up? Yes, you're quite right. The sheep will do what you think the sheep will do, probably a number 2 as well as a number 1, because it's so terrified. And the man does not care. He's found his sheep. That's all that matters. He can get the sheep back to the flock. He's now a good shepherd. He can change his clothes when he gets back home. Remember, he'll only have 1 tunic and 1 cloak. So he'll do his washing and then party. Not because you'd party just because you found a sheep, but in terms of Jesus, you party at any opportunity. Any excuse for party is Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate party animal. And then we have, there's a sheep being lost. Then we have the woman who loses her coin. It could be part of her headdress because it's part of her bridal price. That's possible. Or it might be she's just been given by her trusting husband money for the household expenses, but she's lost her coin. She's a bad housekeeper. So she lights a lamp, she sweeps the house because the houses were really dark. She hopes to hear the tinkle of the coin. And when she does, interestingly, the shepherd would say, the sheep that got lost wasn't my fault, the sheep's fault. The woman says, the coin I lost. Women are fundamentally more honest than men. She finds the coin and she parties. Come around, girls. We're having, gin and whatever girls have, I don't know. But it's party time. And then, of course, the 2 lost sons. Father has 2 sons. When a story begins, a father has 2 sons. the ancient mind would expect the pecking order would be followed. The father will speak, the elder son will speak, the younger son will speak. Who speaks first? The younger son, because he's an upstart. And what does he say? He says, Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me now what I'll get when you are dead. And the father says, okay, son. And he gives him the land, which he promptly sells. That's what he's given. That's where the wealth is. So he sells the land, which really, in a sense, isn't his to sell because it belongs to God. But he sells up and moves out and loses all his money. Eventually coming to his senses and saying, my dad's servants are fed. I am starving. I'll go home and I'll be a hired hand. And he prepares his speech. But his father sees him from a long way off. And he is also moved in his bowels and rushes to his son. And there's one theory that the father has to get to his son because the villagers would know he's disgraced his father by his behaviour and would be out to kill him if they get the chance. So he shows that this is still his son with the best suit, the signet ring, and of course a party. But what is also interesting is how the father will shame himself in this little episode. Because one thing that patriarchs never do in the ancient world and in the modern world when you're in flowing gowns is you never ever run. You float. Like a priest in his alb on the sanctuary. You float. Am I touching this? I don't know what I'm doing. But like a priest on the sanctuary, you float. With the pigs. Have the fatted calf, the eldest son. You float. But in order to run, when you're in long flowing garments, what do you have to do? You have to hitch them up. And when you hitch them up, you show your legs, and that's shameful. And when you run, you show the soles of your feet, which is shameful. This man is willing to shame himself in public to get to his son. And it's that, I think, above all else, that moves the son. And he only gives part of his speech. I no longer deserve to be called your son. He doesn't say, treat me as one of your hired servants. He's just overwhelmed by the love shown by his father. The elder son is in the fields, and he won't join the party. He shames his father by refusing to go into the party. And his father has to come out and speak to him. And he complains. You've never given me anything. He's got everything now. He owns all the property, which his father simply has use of until he's dead. But no, that doesn't influence him. And like all the great parables, this one ends without being complete. We don't know how the son finally reacts. Whether he goes into the party and says, sorry, Dad, really, sorry, I misbehaved. Or whether he remains intransigent. It ends ... because parables are meant to make you think. But because the Pharisees and the scribes are the initial ones who complained, we can imagine that we're meant to think that they remain uncontrite and continue with their complaints. The rich manager, another parable of Luke, which we only get in Luke, and I really don't know what's going on. He does a deal with the merchants in order to lessen their bills and gets away with it. And his master, who has sacked him effectively, praises him for being so astute. Really, it's very odd. We're not quite sure what's going on in terms of the dealings he does. A great parable, and one often used to describe first world and third world relationships, is the man who is so rich he can dress in purple. Purple was the most expensive dye across the ancient world. If you could afford to farm the murex snail, sea snail, so you had millions of them, and you could afford to get them harvested and then boil them for days and days and days, you would get the purple dye and you'd become really, really rich. But you had to be able to invest lots, of course, in order to gain lots. He dresses in purple and fine linen. His underwear is the best that Egypt can provide. And he feasts magnificently every day. Every day. Not just high days and holy days. Every day. His blood pressure must have been sky high. And everything else. At his gate, Lazarus, who is also in purple, but his purple are the bruises and the savaging by the street dogs. He longs to eat the scraps which fall from the rich man's table. That's the bread that they wipe their hands on and discard for the house dogs to eat. He'd love to eat what the house dogs are eating, but instead he's being eaten by the street dogs. Both die, and there's a great reversal. The worst thing about this, I think, is the fact the rich man knows Lazarus' name. Abraham, Father Abraham, send Lazarus, G&T please, lots of ice. Still has the same mentality. And when he thinks about his brothers at the end of the parable, we shouldn't think, he had a heart after all. No, there's no individuality in this society. Family is all things. You are who you are because of your family, so it's natural for him to think of himself in thinking of his family. And the great line at the end. If they won't listen to Moses and the prophets, even if someone would rise from the dead, they won't believe either. Another parable which probably, in its final form, comes after Jesus' resurrection. But an absolutely brilliant parable, and I've no idea why this is playing up so. Really, it must people following this on the live streaming will wonder what on earth's going on. And I don't know either. Not done this before. But we're nearly there. And 10 lepers. The important part of this miracle, this healing, is not that they are not grateful. If you suffered from leprosy, which wasn't Hansen's disease, but excluded you from society, then if you were cured, you would be deeply, deeply grateful. Imagine back in the 1980s or so, if you contracted AIDS, and then suddenly the doctor could say, it's gone. No trace of it. Even an avowed atheist might be heard to say, thank God. And in this society, very religious society, the 9 who are Jewish would be, as fast as they could go, joining a caravan to go to Jerusalem to offer the necessary sacrifice to show they were clean and have the priest say, you are clean. And then they're back in society. Their lives, which were going to end horribly, and they probably only exist because they're in a group, now they're able to return. The one who comes back is a Samaritan. He should be going to Mount Gerizim to offer sacrifice. He comes back to Jesus. But what does Jesus say? Has only this one come back to give glory, to give thanks to God? What he has perceived, which the others haven't, is that where you give thanks to God now is not in Jerusalem, and it's not in Mount Gerizim. It's wherever Jesus is standing. He comes back to give glory and thanks to God, to Jesus. This is about who Jesus is in this little story, brilliantly told. Now, we've got the judge and the widow. We're going to have to hurry on, I'm afraid. She's threatens to give him a black eye. He gives way because she's so persistent. We have the wonderful story, we're going to get this on Saturday, of the tax collector who goes home justified, as opposed to the model of righteousness. The one who prays and says, God, you're so lucky to have me worship you. He's a model. Jewish mothers would want their children to be like this man. He's so pious. He fasts twice a week. You only ever have to fast one day in the year in Judaism. He fasts twice a week. He tithes everything. He is perfect. Except he despises other people. And in Jesus' book, that means you can never be righteous with God. You can never go home justified. Now, Zacchaeus. We've got a few other parables, but one of them certainly I don't understand, which is, again, the parable of the talents, which we mentioned. So we're going to end with Zacchaeus. This brilliant story. Jesus is visiting Jericho, And Zacchaeus, who is a senior tax collector, therefore a very wealthy man, and as a tax collector, of course, unscrupulous, squeezing whatever he could from people in their taxes, having bought the rights to tax people. So he wants to see Jesus. He's a curious chap, and so he climbs a tree, which is a bit like the bank manager. Imagine Mr. What's it in Dad's Army? Mr. Mannering, well done, thank you. As the bank manager up a tree. Really? It's not the sort of behaviour you expect. And Jesus passes by below and says, Zacchaeus, he knows his name, come down, I'm going to stay with you tonight. And everybody complains. Doesn't he know? This is a tax man. And he stands his ground and says, look, if I've defrauded anybody, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. And he says, I am giving, was it half what I have to the poor? But I am giving. That's what he actually says. Not, you've changed my life, Lord. I will do this in the future. It's what he's doing now. Now, my theory. I don't believe this. Oh, this is so annoying. Yeah, I think perhaps it's the best we go. But he, senior tax collector. If you think back to John the Baptist, in Luke's Gospel, we actually hear what John the Baptist says to those who come to him. To the soldiers, take no more than your pay. Which, given that soldiers depended on looting, booty, is an amazing thing for him to say. And the tax people come to him, tax gatherers, and he says, take no more than you should. Now, where John was baptizing is in the Jordan. Jericho is by the Jordan. This curious man, and of course Luke emphasizes that he's curious, he climbs a tree. Is it beyond reason to think he heard of John the Baptist and went out to listen to John the Baptist? I was actually moved by what he heard John say, take no more than your due, and actually followed that through and becomes the most amazing man, perhaps in the whole of the Gospels, a tax collector who is an honest man. I am giving half what I have to the poor. If I have defrauded anybody, I'm certainly I have defrauded because I'm a tax collector. I defraud everybody. No, if I have, I'll make up 4 times as the law commands. Why did Jesus go to Zacchaeus? Because he was an honest man. And the very end of the story says he came to save what was lost, which is Luke's add-on. It's not part of the original story, I don't think. I think we have this most amazing story of Zacchaeus, who really should be holy Zacchaeus. Because if he was an honest tax collector, he must certainly have his place in heaven. Thank you for your kind attention. Next week, we're looking at the Gospel of John. Sorry, we missed out on some of the parables.